happened to hear Aubrey and I were talking this morning about how fun it is for us to be able to come and participate and share what we're doing with you. And it's a time when we sort of share secrets with one another, and that's fun too. We get to learn from one another. And what a wonderful presentation from John this morning. I'm excited about those tools. I want to go back and Google some words, because I just got to bet that behavior beats out incentivizing, and probably motivation. And I think that's our real forte. I mean, it's certainly what I've been selling and what Aubrey's been selling, and that's what we do. And there's a market for it. At least it's been pretty good to us. Motivation is a good word. I bet accountability beats out motivation. So I'm going to go back and those are empirical questions, and I'm looking forward to playing with that tool. I want to talk about leadership today, and I have to apologize. Some of you may have seen the earlier description. I sometimes juggle too many balls, and I got confused. I thought I was presenting an invited address at ABBA, which I am, but somehow I submitted the same paper to both places, somehow thinking they were one. So I was quite surprised when I get an invitation to the speaker dinner at the OBM conference. And I write Heather back and say, am I presenting there? And at the same time I found the program, and there I was. So, so we did a last minute change, and if you came for the other talk, see me at ABBA. I'll talk about some of our adventures in trying to develop our market and our business internationally. What I thought was more appropriate to talk to this group, though, are some of the things that we've been doing to address leadership and to enhance leadership accountability, particularly in the area of safety. As most of you know, our area of expertise and what my company is built on is assisting organizations in safety improvement initiatives, what's commonly in our market called behavior-based safety. And the great thing about that market is what we sell is behavior change. I mean, people recognize that safety is a behavioral issue. And so it's easy for us. And we know who buys that. At least we know who opens the door, because it's almost always the safety manager. And it is easier for us to get in to talk to the safety manager than it is for us to get in to talk to the CEO. So there are several advantages to that. But as we all know, safety and behavioral-based safety is about leadership. And the success of our efforts hinge on how successful we are in building leadership support for these kinds of systems. And so we made some changes over the last year that I think are kind of interesting, and I hope you'll find them interesting as well. What I want to start with, how many of you heard my presentation in 2009? Okay, a handful. So for those of you that were there, you're going to have to sit through some of the same data as I go through our history, because that allows me to make this into a story. I can kind of go back and talk about how our interest in leadership developed, and I think you'll see the evolution. So this will be reviewed for some of you, and I apologize for that. These are some data from a study we did. We published the first set of data in professional safety back in the year 2000. And what these graphs are showing basically is when leaders do the safety observations, safety walk-arounds in their facilities, if they are actively engaged in doing those observations, they get higher levels of participation from employees in doing safety observations. So if leaders do 80% of the observations they're scheduled to do at those facilities, they average better than 60% participation. That is, 60% of their employees participated in doing safety observations. So you understand what these graphs are showing? If the leaders don't do so many, they struggle. And this was the first year, and we thought this was pretty significant in terms of the implementation of our efforts. But look at the data for the second year. Now, there were changes in the organization. There are a lot that goes on. This isn't a clean experimental study by any means. But nonetheless, my takeaway from that is, as important as leadership involvement is in the beginning, as we kick off our initiatives, it becomes even more important in achieving sustainable systems. And we've sort of replicated that in a variety of ways. Excuse me. This is home health care nurses, a study we did probably 10 years later, and it just sort of again shows the correlation between leaders' observations, and this is just number of observations, and these are the ones done by leadership, and these are the ones done by employees, and you see a pretty strong correlation. As I said in the last presentation, I don't think this is at all about modeling. I think it's to some degree, it affects the credibility of what the leader says if they are asking people to do something they're making time to do. But what I really think has to do is contingencies. Okay? So they tighten them up, when they get loose, everybody suffers. And this was a big deal in the early stages of behavior-based safety, because in the early days of behavior-based safety, there were many of our competitors that were implementing behavioral observation systems that only involved employees. In fact, there's still some out there today. And they don't have leadership involved in doing those observations. So at the time, that was data supporting our approach, and we obviously had a vested interest in that. The other thing we routinely do is track leadership's participation, in part kind of coming out of that. And occasionally we'll have a company who comes to us and wants to buy a behavior-based safety process, but they don't want us doing anything with leadership. So the bare minimum we will do is track leaders' participation in the process. And this is a sample report, and actually this is a generic one, but what this report allows us to do is see who's doing observations, how many total observations they've done, and we can look at, and this we could actually spread this out and look over the last 12 months. We can see how many observations they've done. You know, we see that this person has done observations for the last 3 months, and this person has done 2 months for the last for November and December. We can spread that out and look at a year's worth of data. We can look at employees, we can look at designated observers, we can look at supervisors, or we can pull a report for managers and performance appraisal time or whatever. So this is the bare minimum of our intervention in working with leadership. And we still do some of those, though more typically what we're doing these days is bundling an intervention focusing on leaders and getting them engaged in promoting safety, along with, sort of parallel to, the implementation of our behavioral safety efforts, almost under the umbrella. And then Dominic Cooper, who's kind of odd personally, but he does some good science. And he published this article, and what the point of his article was that employees need to see leaders doing something. It's probably not as critical that they're doing an observation, but they need to see them doing something that promotes safety, whether it's making sure a safety-related work order gets addressed, or doing the observations themselves, or hosting a safety committee meeting, whatever it is. So our takeaway from that was what we really need to focus on is visible safety leadership. And even before that article came out, some of my colleagues, Rodney Matthews in particular, was already beginning to use checklists around leadership behaviors. And here's a sample, and we would track these in different ways, either just a yes, no, in the, whether they've done it during the week, or sometimes a frequency count, various ways. And then this book came out, and John referred to it earlier, had a cover shot, his presentation as well. And one of the things I liked about this book, it was disappointing that behavior-based safety wasn't in there, since we make such extensive use of checklists. I wouldn't have thought it would have been that hard to find in a literature search. And we use checklists in a lot of other ways as well. But one of the things I liked about this book was the different kinds of checklists. He talks about how they structure them in the airlines, and the development process they went through in the medical field and developing them, and he talks about, a to-do list is a checklist, and a meeting agenda is a checklist, and so one of the things that occurred to me was, maybe there's some other ways to create checklists, and another point that John made, it is important how we talk about things. I don't use much jargon in our implementations, but I do try to use a certain level of precision in my English. And what I have found is it is easier for me to intervene working with leaders when I'm talking about structuring their agenda for safety and what they're going to cover in their staff meetings than it is to talk about the leadership checklist. Now, there are times when a checklist may be more appropriate, where there are a variety of kinds of behaviors you want to prompt, and the checklist probably serves. But I have had great success, somewhat better success, I think, than with checklists, in structuring the agendas at different levels of the organization. And there's some advantages to that, because when we track the leadership checklist, oftentimes that involves entering the data in the computer, tracking it the same way we're tracking behavioral safety observations. And when we do it within the agendas that they're using in the meetings, we can basically set that up as a paper and pencil, give them a notebook, some agenda forms, and they can just track it. And that allows also some other advantages like flexibility. So they can be talking about lockout, tagout issues this month, and then they can put on the agenda, maybe driven by the observation data or near miss data or worst case incident data. They can put a different focus for the following month. And they can cascade that in a systematic way down through the organization. So this is what I sort of wanted to talk about today, is kind of how we have shifted from the use of leadership checklists, and I thought that was a great innovation for us in adding value to the VBS process, to how we talk about how we're talking about it today. And I thought I'd just, again, to give it a story and a context, we had a company recently, and it's actually probably the first or second major client we implemented. Around the same time, some of you may have seen the JLBM article on Citco. Around the same time, we did a gas pipeline company. It was called Tenneco Gas at the time. It was El Paso Energy today. But they called us probably the middle of last year sometime, and they had an interesting problem. And the problem was that all of the incidents that they had experienced in this one division had occurred when no supervisor was present. They do pipeline maintenance out in the field, and they don't have. And let me just kind of go through what we learned during our assessment as we looked at sort of the points of contact that each of the leaders had with the employees who were the ones that were getting injured. And so the director had a weekly staff meeting with his managers. And I'd say they did this pretty well. They started the meeting with safety, and they didn't just talk about incidents. They were actually talking about what they could do to make their observation process better, what they could do to improve the quality of the observations, what other things they needed to do from a facilities perspective. So they were talking about behavior at that level. So I was pretty impressed with that. A lot of times, I tell companies, if you put safety on the agenda, that makes you about a C student. Because the way most companies do it is, do we have an injury? Did anybody get hurt? Was there an incident or near miss? And then if the answer is no, they go on and talk about other things. I have long been saying in this marketplace, behavioral safety is about safety leadership too. It's as much about safety leadership behaviors as it is about employee behaviors. And that's what we want them to do. In the context of their meetings such as this, we want them talking about, hey, what have you done to promote safety in the last week, and what are you going to do in the coming week? And they were pretty close. So they were well on the way at that senior level. Then we got down here to the next level where we looked at what the managers did. And the managers, most of them had individual contact, sometimes formal. Generally it was less formal sort of interactions, oftentimes by telephone, because this is a widely dispersed. I mean, they take gas from Brownsville, Texas, and they take it through a pipeline all the way up to Buffalo, New York, with a lot of other places in betwixt and between. So a lot of these were obviously long distance and over the phone. And then we got down to looking at what the leads did. This is a frontline supervisor. And they had what I call a pretty impressive process as well. What they did typically in lining out a job was they would have a tailgate meeting first thing in the morning where they talked about what the hazards were in the job that were coming up during the day. And that was pretty well institutionalized, and they did that pretty well. Now, I say they did that pretty well. There was all what I would describe as a wide range of how well. it was done. In some cases, it was more or less just kind of ticking the box to, okay, we talked about safety, now let's talk about what we got to get the job done. In other cases, there were people who took it more seriously and did a better job with it. And then what I really liked was sort of the next stage that afternoon, they would place a telephone call to the employees. Now this is where we saw the opportunity, because that telephone call, basically the purpose was to see how much progress they made on the job. And so what we decided was that there would be added value if we sort of expanded the purpose of that telephone call and ensured that that phone call also started off with a discussion of safety that was tied back to what they talked about that morning in the tailgate meeting. All right, you said that pinch points were going to be a significant issue, one of the bigger hazards on this job. What did you do to mitigate that? What changed? Was there anything that changed in that job that created a different hazard that we didn't talk about this morning? And we also began to build in discussion around near misses. You know, 2 years ago when I was here, I talked about things we were doing in process safety management. And we sort of extended this into other environments where process safety isn't so much the issue. There's almost always an opportunity to have a discussion and ask people about near misses. And guess what? You uncover a lot more of them if you ask about it in a one-on-one conversation than you do if you ask them to fill out a form and turn it in and expect that they have to, in some cases, then go through a very extensive investigation procedure, and there are a lot of organizational consequences. Who's got time for a piece of paper anyway? And I'm out in the field, it's not exactly a convenient thing to turn that piece of paper in. And so we found that you can build that in to behavioral observations in some cases. We'll talk about that briefly in a minute. But certainly in this context, it was also easy for the leads to ask if there had been any first aids or minor injuries that would be instructive to talk about across the organization. And then, of course, we support that at the next level, because what we want the managers talking about now, we want the managers talking to the leads about the quality of the conversations that took place in the tailgate meetings. Did you think that people were involved? How did they respond? What did you see them doing differently? How does what they are telling you, or what they're talking about coming out of their observations, compare with what you observe when you're doing your observations? So we have a focus on sort of the quality, and we sort of cast this under the umbrella of leadership development, with a focus on developing the safety leadership of the lead. So that's kind of the part of the objective, and that's kind of the umbrella we put over this process. And then obviously we try to provide a little more structure and data around the meeting that the director had with his staff. And I wish I had data on safety from this, but actually this has just kind of come to completion. I do have a sample of the checklist. How many of you are from Western? Does this look familiar to any of you? 30 years ago or so, when I was coming out of Malot's behavioral supervision system, we had these recurring and non-recurring task agendas where we met with our doctoral supervisor every week, and guess what? This is exactly what, in fact, I use the same form. I use a master form that I had in an old Word format from 40 years ago. So it's taken me 30 years to get back to it. Malot was right. I guess it's kind of far. It's taken Abba 30 years to find him an elected president. So we've also discovered our Malothian roots. And you can see the kind of things in there, asking managers about coaching their leads. So we're creating discussion at that level so that the director is talking with his managers about the discussion they had with their leads around their safety and the quality of their tailgates, etc. So that's really the bulk of the content I put together for this. Richard was asking me about timekeeping and allowing time, and I said, you know, I always come up short because I usually want to make a point to tell you what I've got to say, and then shut the heck up and let you go have coffee. But I thought so this is a filler to sort of flesh out some of the rest of the time. The nature of our business has changed significantly. In 2010 was a hard year for my company. Our revenue was probably off 80%, which is a pretty significant hit. It caused us a lot of pain internally. We lost some key consultants. Luckily, they were able to find gainful employment with Aubrey was smart. And I've got some of his old hands working in our international work. But the interesting thing about, as hard as 2010 was, in the last quarter of that year, it was our best year ever for sales. So, but the other thing that changed in 2009, probably 100% of our work was, or at least probably 98% of it was in North America. And today, I would say 80% of our work is international, outside of North America, which has been a big change in cultural adjustment and has been, quite frankly, a very painful experience for most of us involved in it. I'll give you the gory details and some of the lessons learned if you come to the talk on that. One of the other things we've done is add close calls to the observations, just like when we have supervisors in a process facility going out and talking with the operators about their process issues. We'll tell supervisors, as you're doing your observations and walking through your area, as you're having the discussion around what you saw, ask people if they've seen any near misses. Again, we found that as a better way of capturing them, and we can write them in the comment section on the observation form. That gets entered into the computer. At the end of the month, we create a list of all of those comments. So each one of those then gets reviewed by the safety committee. It's fairly easy to do, and it gives us a much higher rate of data on near misses, close calls, minor first aid kinds of injuries than we ever got through any kind of paper recording system, even when we incentivize it well. The other thing, and this has been a big change sort of correlated with our work internationally, is, you know, any of you who have read my book know that we have a bias towards trying to get everybody in the organization involved in doing safety walk-arounds with some frequency appropriate to the nature of their work. We don't make people do it, but we strive to get 60 or 70% of the production employees involved in doing a safety walk-around once a week or every couple of weeks. And what we are doing more internationally is what I would call sort of the designated observer model, where somebody on each crew becomes a point of contact and volunteers to be an observer. And basically at that point, once they volunteer, they go through the training. There's an expectation that they'll do an observation every day. And it's scheduled, and you know, they have time to do it every day. And they do an area walkthrough, so they may observe 2 or 3 employees, a handful of employees on each observation, where most of the time when you have enough employees involved, it's more of just an individual or observing a couple of employees that may be working on a shared task. So that's been a change, and it seems mostly just because that's an easier process to administer. It doesn't take as much motivation to get people to volunteer. Once they have agreed to be an observer, they generally will do their observations, and we obviously are tracking that and reviewing it. So if somebody begins to drop off, well, their leadership is pretty much on top of that and following up and looking to get them back active and involved. The other change, and this is really sort of looking forward, I see DJ is here, and we're kind of going to kick this off in a big way at BSN this year. The other thing we're going to try is a very targeted, different kind of sort of targeted intervention on what I would call recalcitrant managers. I mean, almost always in a large enough organization, there are a couple of people at the executive level that don't quite have the buy-in to safety that you would like. And DJ's area of expertise is ACT, coming out of the relational frame theory stuff, you know, and the acceptance and commitment therapy. Takes me a minute. It's not something I'm fluent in. But we're going to try to sort of have a more clinical kind of intervention as part of our coaching process for leaders to make sure that they are sort of committed to have a deeper understanding of our shared value for safety and concern for the well-being of their employees. And I'm excited about that. We're looking forward to getting it kicked off and seeing what kind of interest we can develop in the marketplace. So that's all I see.